for coming today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, pay respects to the elders, past and present, of the Wurundjeri people, and recognise that injustices towards Aboriginal people in Australia continue today. So today's forum has been organised by CAWG, the Climate Action Working Group, which is part of the Campus Environment Collective here at Melbourne Uni. We've also been supported today by the Greens on Campus and the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and the Student Union. The purpose of today's forum is to start a discussion about how effective action on climate change can be achieved in Australia. Australia is currently the highest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. The scientific consensus is that if the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is reduced from its current level of 390 parts per million to 350 parts per million within 10 years, then we'll have a 67% chance of avoiding dangerous runaway climate change. But the longer we take to act, the higher the risk will be. CAWG's position is that securing a safe climate for us and for future generations requires a transformation of the methods of energy production. We are calling for a transition to 100% renewable energy by 2020 and argue that the current, unlegislated, provisional target of only a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020 to be achieved mainly through market mechanisms is completely inadequate. We know what needs to be done, and recent work by the group Beyond Zero Emissions has shown that it is technically feasible. Their fully costed plan, Zero Carbon Australia, was recently released in collaboration with the University of Melbourne, but unfortunately this kind of plan is absent from the current mainstream political debate. The Greens party is not a contender for government at this stage, but may well end up holding the balance of power in the Senate. Here in Melbourne, there's a good chance that we will elect our first Greens member to the House of Representatives. What our speakers today will be talking about, and what we encourage you to think about, is what is possible where climate change is concerned and what we can expect from our parliamentary system in delivering the kind of action that is required. If we cannot reasonably expect the system to deliver what is needed as a matter of urgency, what else can we do to make sure effectual climate change policy becomes a reality? So I'll encourage you all to ask questions and make comments at the end after we've heard from our speakers. Our first speaker today is Jasmine Ali, who is a member of CAWG and a climate change campaigner.
Thanks everyone for coming today. I've heard a bit of a spiel, hopefully it's informative. So in terms of what we're seeing around climate change, the seriousness of the issue I think confronts us all. We're seeing right now in Pakistan people are drowning with the floods, and you can see on the other hand in Russia's engulfed in a series of fires that are threatening nuclear research institutes. The IPCC chief came out recently to comment on what's happening in Pakistan, and he said that although Pakistan only emits a fraction of the world's global emissions, it's bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And I think that's across the world, that the way that climate change is going to affect people across the world, and in terms of those pressures, it's not going to affect everybody equally. And I guess as Libby has been saying before, we know what needs to be done. 80% cuts are needed based on 1990 levels in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. In Australia, the bulk of the emissions come from the energy, transport and agricultural sector. And the bulk of these emissions still, if you break that down, comes from industrial rates. And you can see the Australian government's response to this. We've seen over the last 3 years a toing and froing of inaction. And you can see that basically, in essence, I think that the impact in terms of what the government's done around climate change in Australia has been basically insignificant. The election, we've seen Abbott hardly mention the issue. We've seen Gillard, who's announced what she considers a People's Assembly to come to some community consensus upon a carbon price. We've also seen her put forward a climate clunker scheme, which is ripping out $200 million from the solar flagship scheme that Labor was already introducing. And the understanding of the long-term proposal of the carbon price is to reintroduce an ETS by 2013. So the failure of Rudd and Gillard to act on climate change, for many people in Australia, people are looking to the Greens, particularly in this election, as hopefully for many people to secure the balance of power in the Senate, and in that sense to be able to pose an alternative in terms of the debate around on the issue. And I think having Greens in Parliament, and particularly Greens in the Senate, can send a message to Labor. But there are, however, I think some very serious realities that, for those who want serious action on climate change, need to confront with this issue. And with in terms of the Greens ascendance to the Senate. And I think they can be summed up in 2 points. Firstly, there's no guarantee that the Greens can have political influence in the Senate. So in terms of having 2 or 3 more seats, you saw the debacle around the sea clearance last year. If Labor is determined to deal with the Liberals on its major policies around climate change, it effectively does rule out the balance of power for the Greens coming into effect. So bipartisan support for policies in that sense basically means that the balance of power is meaningless. I think the second key issue, and I think it's an issue that often doesn't get critically engaged with a lot in the public debate, is the idea that market-based mechanisms can somehow be a strategy to deal with serious emissions reductions and a more large-scale transition towards renewables. In Europe, we've seen the emissions trading scheme collapse twice. Basically, I mean, I don't know for many people if they've worked the ins and outs of it, but you know, the general idea, the general gist is to turn carbon into a commodity that is good to be bought and sold and traded, and thereby pollution in this sense is actually transformed into a property right. So companies and corporations that incur penalties will also be legally entitled to compensation. And I think the major impact of this, these sort of emissions trading schemes as well is it transforms or places the pressure of dealing with climate change onto the shoulders of working people. So here in Australia, Bundt's scheme, the last version of the scheme, there was $16 billion that were going to be put towards the major polluters. Export industries, which are some of the most carbon intensive, like aluminium and agriculture, were actually to be exempted under the scheme. And I think you can see, like I sort of touched on before, that the ETS is highly inequitable. And in terms of actually seeing, you know, the most vulnerable and poor sections of Australian society are going to be affected the hardest by the introduction of any sort of emissions trading scheme. And you can see right now that the cost of living, in terms of the fluctuating petrol prices, the rise of interest rates, and yeah, so much the cost of living before. People in some sense are actually, because of these financial pressures, doing it quite hard right now. I don't know if some people saw the Q&A on the issue. Someone was talking about, you know, over the last year, people are paying $10 extra for childcare per day to be able to you know, have their, while they go off to work, have their kids looked after. So in this sense, I think that's a you know, the inequity of the scheme is something to keep in mind. And I think also another facet in terms of looking at the effectiveness of, you know, emissions trading schemes to operate, given the crisis of the global economy, where we're seeing millions of dollars thrown at across the world to prop up failing banks. In my opinion, I think placing the future of emissions mitigation into the hands of a highly volatile market scheme repeats the very mistakes that have actually produced the dangers of global warming and climate change to begin with. So in terms of this deadlock that we've seen in the Senate over the last, well not in the Senate, in the parliamentary debate as such over the climate change issue, we've seen the Greens come up with its idea of an interim carbon tax, which is the idea that a price on carbon will be set to transition into a more robust, what is understood as a robust trading scheme. And I think you can, you know, the idea of the carbon tax is, I mean, quite similar to the, you know, basic sort of fundamentals of the emissions trading scheme, that, you know, by putting a price on pollution, it makes polluting forms of energy more expensive, which would, in theory, supposedly encourage the private sector to invest in renewables. If you look at, again, I'll turn to Europe a lot in terms of talking about this, but 5 countries in Europe, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands and Finland, have all introduced low carbon taxes since the 1990s, and all have failed in these countries to deliver serious emissions reductions. And actually, in Norway, emissions has actually risen by 17%, and likewise in some of these other European countries, emissions has actually gone up despite the introduction of these carbon tax schemes. So, in that sense, and like another similarity, like I sort of touched on before, is the idea that the inequity of a carbon tax as well is going to be about punishing people, working people in this country for using electricity. And, you know, basically carbon is distributed in the economy, and every good that's produced in this sense, I think it's important to keep in mind. So, you know, I guess it raises the question of what is an alternative to market mechanisms, and I think direct and full government investment into renewable, large-scale infrastructure and the creation of a wide range of green jobs, I think is a demand that needs to be raised front and centre of the climate movement right now. Adam Bandt here in Melbourne has rightly been raising the demand of 100% renewable energy by 2020, a demand based on science, and it's also been based on the research by Beyond Zero Emissions. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with that, but it calls for the mass rollout of high-speed rail and the development of concentrated solar thermal, which is currently commercially available technology, and it's actually powering a third of Spain's economy right now. So, I mean, I think, you know, another question that's raised with this is in terms of, in terms of the carbon tax leading to, you know, people ensure that it will encourage, you know, private investment into the renewables market. But I think you can see that private companies are simply not willing to put up the type of investment capital that is needed for large-scale renewable infrastructure, simply because of the reason that it doesn't produce any short-term profitability. And that's, you know, in a long-term sense, there's, you know, profits to be made in that way, but in a short-term sense, you can see things like the Abbotsford solar panel factory and research facility in Abbotsford, Victoria, last year went into voluntary receivership because of the lack of private investment capital. So Beyond Zero Emissions recommends a cost of 372 billion over the course of 10 years. Roughly that's about 42 billion a year. And that comes down to, basically equates to what Julia Gillard is proposing for, you know, Labor's National Broadband Network. So I think a common question raised when you put these facts to people is where will the money come from? I think there's two main ways to deal with this. Firstly, it's transforming the priorities of where the money is spent in the budget already. I think you can have a massive shift in terms of where military spending is being done right now into renewables. They're spending $35 billion on new submarines for defence. And I think the other idea of raising this revenue is by taxing corporations. You can see from the mid-1980s, corporate taxation used to be at the rate of 49%. It's now at a rate, after this election, corporate taxation will be 29%. And I think in that sense, you can look to things like a mining tax that, you know, in some sense, you know, the Labor government did have a crisis around getting, but actually using, you know, taxing multi-billion-dollar profits made from the mining giants in this country to actually provide the capital for large-scale renewables. And I think the final question in terms of is why won't the government do it? It seems very simple that it is possible, it's technically possible, it's economically possible, but what is lacking is there being a political will. And I think to actually demonstrate where the interests of government lie, you can again look at the mining tax. Right, the government talks about raising its corporate revenue, corporate taxation. And as soon as they do this, the mining companies and the mining corporations in this country, they squeal and go like the chickens. And I think these are the sorts of vested interests that we're up against and actually confronting to shift, you know, for a cleaner, you know, electricity grid. And the question of, you know, governments have done it in the past. All of the major infrastructure projects in this country, roads, railways, transport, energy, the energy, electricity grid, these all used to be publicly funded by governments and built by governments. But now what we're seeing is an entrenched privatisation of lots of these public assets and basically, you know, working people out to suck in this pollution and pay extra on their power bills in order to deal with this climate crisis. So I think in terms of actually seeing that obviously the government can do it, but they can only do it if we make them. And I think, you know, looking at history, particularly Australia has a rich history in the last 30 years, I've seen that in that sense, you know, governments follow when people lead, and in a much truer case, you know, you can see here. If you look at in the 1970s, the Builders Latest Federation placed a whole series of green bans refusing to work on heritage listed sites which were to be developed. And particularly in the 1970s, the campaign to stop uranium. In 1976 here in Melbourne, a group of small activists put on a public meeting that launched a movement against uranium that won massive public support and brought, in some sense, public support to the point where workers refused on the docks to actually export uranium in this country. And while at that time, at the beginning of the movement against uranium, there was concern about nuclear. there was not a public opposition to mining and exporting uranium. And a poll in 1977 actually shows that 34% of Australian society at that time opposed uranium mining. But the campaign went out to actually, set out to convince the public not only of the dangers of uranium mining, and within 3 years, through a set of direct actions and an orientation to mass mobilisation and unions, they were able to bring out 20,000 people on the streets to take action and pressure governments to actually ban uranium. And again, like there's examples of wharfies in Melbourne, they voted a ban on working with ships that were carrying imports exporting uranium. They refused to actually work on the docks to actually take up that issue. And I think even during the height of Howard's period, you can look at the campaign to stop Jabiluka, the Jabiluka mine. There was another concerted campaign that actually went out, through again another orientation towards mobilisation and towards unions and taking direct action to actually, in some sense, pressure governments to act and force through changes. So I think in that sense, that's the sort of orientation that we need to have to see that where the solutions for climate change lie. So if you look at the last election, 1 million people voted Green. If you think about if 1 million of these people were actually mobilised, it would seriously strengthen the ability to force through the changes needed to deal with climate change. And I hope Adam is elected, and personally I'm going to vote Green. But I think what the Greens do does actually matter. And I think the crucial question for us all then today is the question after polling day, is where will we all be when Brumby starts setting up the development for his new coal-fired power station in the Latrobe Valley? When Gillard announces, assuming it's Gillard that's in government, that when Gillard does announce that she will push through or pursue on with her carbon price, that's going to entrench carbon markets and will enforce electricity prices up again, which is only going to leave large-scale renewables technology to rot in factories like the solar systems did in Abbotsford. And I think in that sense, what we need to do is raise clear political demands on the government to roll out renewables and green jobs. And we need to raise these demands and connect with people in their workplaces. And in some sense, I think we need to shift away from a paradigm and an idea that we need to punish people, discipline people for using electricity and these goods that people basically have very little choice about, and start to see working as unions as part of the solution rather than the problem.
Thanks, Jazz. Our next speaker is a very busy Greens candidate for the seat of Melbourne. We're excited to see you today to talk about this Adam Bandt.
Thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak today. It's a pretty exciting start to the last week. When I was crossing the road this morning and someone yelled out "Go Greens" from a passing car. That was a pretty exciting start to the last week. I'd like to also welcome here Keith Locke, who's a New Zealand Greens MP, who's the spokesperson on Foreign Affairs, Human Rights, who's come over for a few days to see the beginning of the last week of the campaign. We earlier raised the important question of tipping points, and there's a lot of discussion about parts per million and percentages, but I think it's worth sort of taking a bit of a step back and thinking about where we're at as a planet. Since industrialisation, the whole planet has warmed, on average, by somewhere between 0.7 and 0.8 degrees. The scientists also tell us that because of lags in the climate system, that even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, so if everything was shut down tomorrow, lags in the climate system mean that there's somewhere around the same amount of temperature, possibly a bit higher, that the planet will rise by. It's basically already locked in. So we're looking at a planet that's around about 1.4, 1.5 degrees warmer than at the start of the industrial era, even if we stop everything tomorrow. And they also tell us that there's likely to be something like a tipping point, or several tipping points, after which there is a risk of runaway climate change, where positive feedback loops start to kick in. So for example, as more of the ice melts in the North Pole, there's less white surface that reflects heat, and the oceans absorb it and warm it up. And there's tundra, so more of the tundra is exposed, etc., etc. There's various potential feedback loops that can kick in. They're pointing out to us that once they start, we're not quite sure what's going to happen, hence it's a potential tipping point. And none of it's about certainty, it's all about risk, and it's all about, the planet's a very complex creation, so it's all about measuring the risk. What they tell us is that after a certain tipping point, we run a better than even chance of runaway climate change happening, where we don't know what's going to happen. So we're already essentially at 1.4, 1.5 degrees warmer than we used to be. And what the scientists are telling us is that the tipping point is likely to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The scientists initially thought it was 2 degrees, and each new piece of information that they get revises that downwards. And some of them are suggesting that we're almost already there. So we're looking about 5, 10 years if we want to minimise the risk of getting over that tipping point and giving ourselves a better than even chance of avoiding runaway climate change. And if you think about, you wouldn't get on an airplane if the risk of it crashing was around about 50%, or even if it was 30%, or 20% or 10%. I mean, we insist on a much lower risk of catastrophic events every time we get on the roads or when we get in a plane. But we are in this political environment where the major parties seem to be taking much, much higher risks of the planet reaching that tipping point. And you have Labor's record since, I mean, even if you look at it since the change of leadership, of coal, more export. One of the first actions of Julie Gillard was to approve the export of more coal, delaying climate, introducing price on carbon until 2013, ripping money out of, as Jasmine and Olivia mentioned, ripping money out of funding for solar and renewables to pay for cash for clunker scheme that's probably not going to do anything to reduce emissions. I understand the Labor candidate was invited today and has said no. What she would probably say if she was here is, and I'll step over this side for a moment, she would probably say, well, we put up a CPRS and you voted against it, so what are you doing getting up here talking about the need for climate action? And the answer to that is very, very simple. We do need, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, we do need a robust price on carbon. What the Labor Party put up after their deals with the Liberal Party was what Professor Ross Garnaut called the worst exercise in policy making he's ever seen. And it's a scheme that would have locked in a high pollution future for Australia and would have made it impossible for future governments to amend. If it was something like, say, superannuation, where you introduce the infrastructure of the scheme, you might start low and then eventually increase up. And that's something I think we could have looked very favourably on. And as we did with the Fair Work Act, as we did with the stimulus package, as we did with parental leave, we're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're not going to say, well, it's not exactly what we want, so we're not going to support it. But what the CPRS did was keep Australia's domestic emissions above current levels, so Australia's domestic emissions weren't going to fall. Does anyone know when, under the CPRS, Australia's domestic emissions were going to go below current levels? 2035. When the scientists are saying we've got 10 years, the Treasury modelling that was submitted to the Senate said, well, Australia's domestic emissions aren't going to fall till 2035. Plus it excluded agriculture, it excluded transport, some significant sections of the economy. Plus, it took out that compensation that was meant to go to low-income householders and instead gave it to the poorest. Plus, and this is important, as was referred to before, it's actually the right to pollute or the right to emit becomes a property right. And what that meant was that if future governments wanted to take it, expand it above the 5 to 25% or 5 to 15% range that was proposed, if a future government comes in and says, geez, we need to increase it to 30 to 40% because that's what the scientists are saying, you'd have had to give the polluters yet another round of billions of compensation because you're affecting their property rights. So that's why we say it locked in failure and why we couldn't have supported it. The analogy I use that's a bit closer to home for me as an industrial lawyer is that you might walk into your boss and say, I want a $40 a week wage increase. And they say, well, can't give you 40, I'll give you 25 now, come back and talk to you next year about the rest. You might take that. But if they say to you, can't give you 40, I'll give you 5 on the condition that you don't ask for any increases for the next 20 years, you say, well, that's going to put you behind, I'll come back and talk to you when you're being more reasonable. And that's the position that the Liberal Labor CPRS deal, and that's Labor's position, and now they've delayed even that until 2013. The Liberals, I mean, Labor might deny, I think we need to act quickly, but the Liberals effectively deny it even exists at all, climate change, and suggest that dressing up a bunch of people in khaki, sending them out into the community is going to somehow fix climate change. And when Tony Abbott says that he believes the science is absolute crap, I reckon that's probably what he believes. And you don't choose words like that judiciously. So you have Labor and Liberals sort of effectively saying, well, we don't perceive the need to act either quickly or at all. And that's where the Greens are stepping in with a vision to say that we need to move Australia as quickly as possible to a zero emissions economy and to be guided by the science. I think there's at least 2 things that are going to be needed to make that happen. One is a robust ETS, where you can't get out of it by buying offshore permits that aren't set to any standard. One that has proper targets. One that has the right kind of restrictions to make sure that, as Jasmine alluded to, we don't give the same people who caused the financial crisis just simply another financial instrument to play with and to allow the market to crash. The other thing I think we need is a beginning of redirection of subsidies. At the moment, again, since this Labor government's come to power, they say that they're all in favour of the market and the government can't intervene, yet they're very willing to back losers when it comes to the question of energy. And whilst Australia's, our public transport and our rail freight network, especially here in Victoria, you've got people like Tim Fischer saying, why is our rail freight network withering on the vine and dying? But they find enough money to build new train lines in New South Wales and in Queensland, to dig up more coal so they can get out to the ports more quickly, to get off to China or wherever else it's going to be burnt, causing exactly the same amount of pollution as if it was burnt here. So billions are going into investments in subsidies for the coal industry, and that needs to be redirected to support renewable technologies. And you might want to think about it on a Melbourne day like today, but if there's any country in the world that should be leading the world in renewable energy, it should be Australia. When you think about the natural, the physical, and the intellectual, and the human resources that we've got across this country, there is absolutely no reason why you have a situation where China's second richest man is a billionaire making solar panels, but who did his masters at UNSW. This idea that we're continuing to move and lose these fantastic ideas and skills offshore is something that we should all be condemning, because the countries, there's often the suggestion that the Greens, people sometimes say, well, what's your position as the Greens on economic matters? We know you stand for the environment, but where do you stand for on economic matters? Shouldn't we be concerned? And the answer is that Lindsay Tanner, who currently holds the seat, was retiring, said at one point, a key question for us is, what is Australia going to sell the world in 15 years' time? And I think that's a very, very good question. And if you ask the major parties that, their answer at the moment would be coal, maybe uranium. We, as the Greens say, the answer should be that we should be exporting world-leading renewable energy technology. But it's going to take a sea change in the way that the government approaches its allocation of spending and its prioritisation of infrastructure and research funding to bring that about. But it's something that we can do. To take transport, for example, transport, we have huge emissions coming from transport. And you have a situation here in Melbourne where when one wire breaks, people are left stranded on the roads and the whole city becomes congested. We want to see money, at least 25% rising up to 50% by 2014 of federal road funding, start getting redirected into public transport. We're going to create an enormous amount of jobs, and we're going to turn Melbourne into one of those cities where it's like when you go overseas, you've moved to a good city, you can get around without a car. I don't know that you necessarily say the same in Melbourne, but there's no reason that we can't be there. Again, it's not a question of saying we need more money and more taxes to fund these things. It's a question of saying how do we spend the existing money that we've got, and at the moment funding allocations are completely out of whack. And the financial crisis was mentioned as well. We saw with the financial crisis the speed with which the government can act when it's confronted with what it thinks is a real emergency. And within the space of a couple of weeks, we had enormous expenditure to keep Australia out of recession. And of course, we as the Greens supported that, and the economic evidence at the moment, whilst one might have a lot of questions about how it was in fact rolled out, certainly the economists at the moment are saying it helped keep Australia avoid double-digit unemployment and avoid recession. Our point, I guess, it's not that we shouldn't have done that, but why can't we extend to the planet the same courtesy we extend to a merchant bank? I mean, why can't we act as quickly, given the tipping point crises that we're about to face, why can't we act as quickly to get a robust emissions trading scheme and a redirection of some of those subsidies to get us moving towards a renewable energy economy? And a lot of people say it's impossible and we can't do this. I think that what we need to do is begin the process of getting agreement on the goal. Getting agreement that we need within a very short period of time to move as quickly as possible to a renewable energy economy. There's historical precedent for this, and I know that within the climate movement a lot of people are casting around to say what's the best way of talking about this. Some say maybe it should be like wartime, where we have a wartime mobilisation. My preference is to start looking to the US and to JFK, who managed to say at the beginning of the decade, we're going to put someone on the moon. And then by setting that goal out there and by making sufficient funds available without knowing the exact map of how we're going to get there, once you set that goal and you make it a national priority and an international priority, it can happen. That kind of mobilisation can happen. And so I think we can have debates about whether an ETS or a tax is the right way to go, and our proposal is that it's based on Ross Garner, that we should have an interim carbon tax while we have the debate about what the appropriate targets are and the finer details of the emissions trading scheme. Let's get a tax in place so that we can then ratchet it up to a fully fledged emissions trading scheme. But then you've got, as you said, beyond zero emissions, who've shown that it's technically possible, but it's a question of whether we want to spend the money. Let's agree on the goal, and then we can start having a debate about the best way to get there. And we can start having a debate as a community about how we want to prioritise the allocations of funds, whether we want to pay for that, whether we need gas to transition there, or whether we can go straight to 100% renewable. All these kind of things we can have the debate about, but only once we've agreed on the goal. That involves a bit of vision, and if you look at the two major parties, the way they've been conducting this debate at the moment, you wouldn't say this has been an election campaign characterised by high levels of vision, or by two parties offering us different views about where Australia should be going. What we've had is two major parties running the election as if the only seats that matter, and the only views that matter are in a handful of marginals, now it's heard in New South Wales and Queensland. And because they're running it on that basis, and because they're saying, well, we're not going to lead from the front, we're instead going to attempt to define through focus groups and research what we think those people want to hear, we end up with not an idea that we're going to have grand investment in solar energy technology, but instead we're going to have cash flow conflicts. And that's going to continue to be the case until there's a circuit breaker. And that's why the election in Melbourne, this election that I'm running for, is so important and offers us so many opportunities, because what we are campaigning on here in Melbourne is not who can be the most conservative or who can delay action on climate change the most, or who can be the harshest on refugees, or who can be the strongest opponent of gay marriage. But we're campaigning on having a vision for moving Melbourne and Australia quickly to a renewable energy economy, and having a society based around values of compassion, sustainability and equality. And we've spent the best part of the last year outlining that vision. As Jasmine mentioned, we released a plan for how Melbourne could be moved to renewable energy within a decade if there was the will to do it. We've outlined a plan for how we can get proper childcare within the community. We've talked about a plan for moving people into electric cars after we've got everyone onto public transport and bikes. All of that puts us in a unique position, because it only will take 1 in 10 people who voted Labor last time to vote Greens, and we win our first ever lower house seat in a general election. And that is going to do two things that are really going to help shift the debate, for example, around climate in terms of the next Parliament. One is that people are going to be asking, why did the seat of Melbourne change hands? And the answer to that will be because the values of compassion and sustainability and equality are now mainstream values that deserve a place in Parliament. And we don't want a narrow focus group debate. We instead want a vision for how Australia is going to move forward. And all eyes are going to be on us if we do win, and to be able to give that answer and send it right out across the country is going to be an extraordinarily powerful thing. Secondly, we will be there over the coming years able to help shift the debate nationally. We will have a great platform from which to start putting up these ideas about how Australia could move to a renewable energy economy, about how we have a more compassionate approach to asylum seekers. And when the major parties realise that they don't just have to, or Labor in particular realises that it doesn't just have to look over one shoulder of the Liberals and compete with them to become more like them, but instead has to look over the other shoulder at the Greens, that is going to bring about a change in what is likely to be the next Gillard government as well. So it's pretty exciting time. It's a few days away from this election, and everyone who lives in, anyone who live in this electorate of Melbourne, well, you're amongst the most of this election, because instead of being taken for granted, instead of being in a safe seat, you now are in a marginal seat, a close seat, where your vote makes a huge difference. So you can do something enormously powerful on Saturday, and this election is going to shape the Parliament that will deal with climate change, and we need as many Greens there in both houses of Parliament as possible. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Adam. Did you want to come up the front? We're going to open up the floor to questions and comments. If you do have a comment, I'll ask you to keep it to 2 or 3 minutes, maybe. We're out of time, but yeah.
Jasmine mentioned her opposition to the idea of a carbon tax or market-based mechanism. Correct me while I paraphrase if I get it wrong, but you don't want to punish working class people with increased cost of electricity. And so I understand the Greens support a carbon tax. I was wondering if I could get you to respond to that directly about Jasmine's concern.
I think essential to driving change is a robust carbon price across the economy, and that's necessary to drive change to a renewable energy economy. By taxing the polluters, we can use that money to give compensation to people who will be affected by any consequences of an ETS. But the other thing that I'll say is that, so we think the polluter should pay compensation to low income earners. The first thing that I didn't talk about, but that's number one on our list of tackling climate change, is that energy efficiency is absolutely critical. And through energy efficiency, using technology that's available at Bunnies, you can reduce the average household's energy bills by about 30%. You start doing that, you start reducing cutting power bills. So that's one of the reasons why we couldn't support Labor's CPRs, is that it wasn't going to deliver that. It wasn't going to tax the polluters and give the compensation to households. Instead, the money that was there for households was going up to the polluters.
Yeah, Adam, first of all, I hope you win on Saturday. And you talked about a society organized around environmental sustainability, passion, and quality. I tend to be rather skeptical as to whether that's possible under capitalism, even a regulated capitalism. But I'm an anthropologist, and one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of years is looking at the climate movement in Australia. And in the process of doing that, I came across a group of people in the Green Party in South Australia, Eco-Socialist Network, who have been working in alliance with members of the Socialist Alliance and also independent socialists, and they actually formed a regional climate action group called CLEAN. And so I guess my question is, to what degree has there been a debate within the Australian Greens as to whether we just merely regulate capitalism, or do we begin to have a dialogue about transcending it? Not that that's going to happen anytime soon. We may fry the plant before we get around to doing that, but how much of a, is what's going on in South Australia, this debate about eco-socialism versus regulated capitalism, is that something that permeates the Green Party as a whole? And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, my concern with I think there's a lot that I agree with in that approach, but my concern is that there's this, my concern with the traditional left, if I can call it that, is that there's a lingering view that the state will solve these problems. And I think what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is a tacit agreement by both sides, major sides of politics, for the state to start to withdraw from a lot of those social questions, things get privatised, etc., etc. I'm not convinced that we should be saying government needs to jump back into those things. Because what we're seeing at the moment is increasingly amongst the community, everyone's doing everything they can to combat climate change in their own lives. And that's an overstatement, but certainly in my electorate, there's a lot of people who are making all the changes that they can within their own lives. And they're waiting for government to step up and do their bit. But I think actually self-organisation amongst communities is something that we should be fostering. I don't think that the answer always has to be the state has to regulate everything. I would like to see, for example, money being made available for people to get together in a street or at a neighbourhood level to start to get neighbourhood solar farms, for example, so that they can start to collectivise, I guess, if you want to use that word, some of that at their own level. I don't think that that's automatically the right answer to dealing with climate change. I think instead we have to say the community is already there. How do we support a community that already wants action on climate change?
Yes, I sort of had a theoretical question about EESs and plans like BDE's plan.
Plans like
BDE's renewable plan. So what's going on with ETS kind of had the ETS as a common term of the policy, and so that any other regulations or anything wouldn't affect it. And it just seems to me that there's a bit of a contradiction between that and having a plan like BDE's plan where you're choosing to invest in solar, thermal energy and wind farms and that kind of thing. So I guess Greens are kind of advocating an ETS, but are you also at the same time advocating a plan like BDE's or something like that?
Well, we've been, I mean, if you read the BZE plan, you've seen Christine Milner at the front in the foreword saying this is a great thing because it shows it can be done. And things like a price on carbon, ETS versus a tax, etc., they're mechanisms for how one might start the shift. They don't map out the shift, whereas the plan is helpful to mapping out the shift. And so I think they're both. I think, and why I don't agree with everything that's in that BZE plan, I don't think you can necessarily tick off on that tomorrow because it's an enormous expenditure. We're talking about 43 billion a year, like the broadband network will be a one-off to start saying that per year for the next 10 years. I don't think one ticks off on something like that lightly, but it shows it's technically possible. And so we can then start having a debate about, well, where's the money going to come from? Do we do it all? Do we take 20 years to do it, etc., etc.? So I think it's a good thing that it's there because it will help shift the debate. What we need, this is what I was saying about, we need to agree on the goal, and then we can have some discussions about how we get there. Is a carbon tax or an ATS going to help us get there? Do we need a plan, etc., etc.? But we're not even at the stage yet of agreeing on the goal. And I guess my concern is that we have to win broad-based public support for this, and that a lot of people's eyes sometimes glaze over when we start talking about targets. And I think we need to start thinking about ways of engaging so that it's much more real. And that's why I think we're getting behind something like the plan, not because you want to tick off on it straight away, but because it's helpful to change as possible.
My name's Trent Hawkins. I'm a candidate for the Social Alliance in the seat of Wills, so not in the city of Melbourne. Anyway, I think it was a good event today. Good to hear Adam's points. I also hope that you win. Having heard Kath Botel speak, I get a bit worried about some of her approaches on certain issues. I think that all the people in this room need to take away from, I guess, today and this process that our aim really needs to be to help work to build the climate movement and strengthen the climate movement, because no matter what the results of the elections in terms of the overall result, either party, we're not going to get action on climate change. And I think that guarantee of any real policies being implemented is strong grassroots pressure and self-organisation of community as well. But I guess the question to Adam was more about, if you get elected, how can you help facilitate in Melbourne, with resources and those sorts of things, a sort of strengthened movement, grassroots movement?
Yeah, well, I think that the federal candidate for Melbourne, federal member for Melbourne, would play an important role in a city as compact and diverse as this electorate, of liaising and helping coordinate between the different levels of government and the different levels of organisation that's going on at the moment. I was talking with some residents from public housing the other day who were saying that we need some basic help to get in the Public Housing Association going up, and that's something that one can facilitate being an MP. But I think that there's no reason at all why, and this is what I think I should do, is take the lead on helping pull people together and map out ways in which Melbourne could start leading the country in the transition to renewable energy. And that's going to involve local groups up to and including experts. So I think doing exactly what you're doing, what you're saying, is an important role for the federal member for Melbourne.
I too hope that you will but I would like for you to talk a little bit about the coal power plants here in Victoria.
About the
coal power plants, and like if you have any plans about, I don't know, advocating for closing them or avoiding coal.
Yeah, well, we have our state NLCs have been calling for Hazelwood to be closed. So as soon as we can make a transition to a safe and regular energy supply and move to renewable energy, our state NLCs have been clear on that. I guess my first big, I practice as an industrial lawyer, and my first big case was working for workers in the Latrobe Valley for Danny Vaughan and helping negotiate the first enterprise agreement after privatisation. And I think that one thing that's critical that we can't lose sight of is that if we're going to call for places to be closed, we've got to look after the people in the communities there and actually develop a proper transition plan away. I don't think it's fair for people who live there to do anything other than say the government should help transition them and their communities to a clean energy economy. So that's always been something that we've been saying. But surveys, I spoke to one union who said that they surveyed their members who work in the valley and said to them, if you had a clean energy job tomorrow, would you move away from your current one? And 85% said yes. I mean, I don't think that the people who are working there necessarily want to spend their lives working around polluting coal, where it's about the transition plan. One of the things within the BZE report, I don't know what the name of the institute is here at Melbourne University that helped. Can anyone help me out?
Energy Institute. Melbourne Energy Institute.
Energy Institute. They were saying that geothermal energy down in the valley is possible. We don't know whether it's actually going to be sustainable or whether it will work as baseload power. It'll cost somewhere between $10 and $100 million to do the research to find it out. And if it is, then what a great place to begin the process of geothermal energy. That's not a lot of money when you think that in the first budget Labor put $400 million into carbon capture and storage and then doubled that later on. I mean, we could work out very quickly, very soon, whether whole communities in the Latrobe Valley could be transitioning to geothermal, but we're not doing the research. And that's what I come back to, the allocation of priorities. And so I think, yes, we do need to move away and decommission, especially Hazelwood. I mean, Hazelwood was scheduled to close and they extended its life. But we do need to do it as part of looking after the people we do.
We've got time for one more.
Yeah, I hope you mean to be voting for you. I just wanted to ask, you're talking about sort of tipping points the next 5 to 10 years needing really strong action, the need for a sort of man on the moon kind of goal plan. But you don't seem to be talking about direct investment, at least straight away. And you're talking about sort of transitioning from gas tax, market mechanisms, etc. So my first question is, what do you see as the role of gas? Second question is, sorry, a couple of little ones. When you talk about goals, is it goals within the community, like needing it? Because I think there's a consensus for action, and I think we need leadership. Is it goals within the party? We agree with the scientific goals because we have them. The third question is, you're talking about geothermal. Is it, with the BZE stuff, is it that you're not prepared to commit to solar thermal as baseload, or
I think the kind of leadership and goals that I'm talking about is we need political leadership, and it's lacking at the moment. And so we need political leaders who, and ultimately we need a snowy hydro for the 21st century, basically. Now, how that's funded, how we bring it about, etc., that's debates that can be had by experts who know about this stuff. But if the goal is we need to move quickly to a renewable energy economy and we're going to do it within a period of time, then let's have the debate about the plan and the best way to get there. And so the expert gas versus, when can we bring coal power stations offline so that we don't compromise energy supply? Do we need to supplement it with gas, etc.? I think we leave it up to the people who know those technical questions to have that debate. But at the moment, we're not even. There's no authority that we're asking. There's no clean energy authority that we're asking to map out that transition and to tell us how we get there. So the kind of leadership that I'm talking about is political leadership that says this is where we need to get to within the next period of time. And then I'm saying I think we need to start calling on the expertise that we've got to help us get there. And so there's people who know better than me about whether we need gas as part of the transition or whether geothermal is better than you want experts working on that, and we've got them here in Australia.
I think that's pretty much it. I think Jazz would like to make some closing comments in response.
I sort of tends to make some comments about the tax. I think with the issue of the tax, like Jason's pointing out, there is an extreme uncertainty about how corporations will respond to the carbon tax, and there's also an extreme debate in terms of what is the carbon price needed to actually make renewables competitive. And you can get people, pitching from $23, per tonne to Mark Dissendorf, who says you need $100 per tonne. So in this sense, there's always the danger of corporations actually passing this cost on to consumers. And I think, in terms of, even recently in New South Wales, the electricity price rises that have been happening there, the New South Wales state government had no idea about actually calculating what this would mean. And this is without even any carbon tax complicating the situation. And I think in terms of picking targets for the movement, like I don't think it's a good enough target to say, you know, to be honest, I don't think that the argument is about whether or not we're going to act. We know we're going to act. We need to act. The question is about what kind of mechanism is actually going to deliver renewables. And I think in that sense, picking targets is not about finding, you know, the right price. It's actually about saying, well, look, they're actually proposing 12 new coal-fired power stations across this country. Right? I mean, every state is going to be receiving a new coal-fired power station, apart from Tasmania. They're also, I mean, I think those are the sorts of targets. Where are the green jobs? Where is the renewable infrastructure? And I think we need to be out and picking those sorts of targets. Those are the only ways you can measure whether the transition's happening or not. So that's what I would argue.
I'd really encourage everyone to get on the CAWG contact list. Our meeting details are there on the board, and please thank our speakers today.
Do you want to email me so I have your address?
Yep.
And then, depending on how much I can compress, I can then email it to you. I might be able to put it on CD or something.
Okay.
There we go. That's great. Beauty.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.